anywheres tend to have achieved identity, a sense of themselves as almost their own invention. They've done well at school, they've gone to more or less good universities, they have more or less successful professional careers, whereas somewheres tend to have their identities are more based around those things about them that are immutable. Your white male, northern working class or whatever. And the somewhere worldview exposes you, I think, to greater discomfort with change. Compared to 60 years ago, we're a lot richer, we're better educated, we are also much more likely to live alone, much more likely to suffer from depression, we're less likely to have children, and if we are a child, we're much less likely to live in with both of our biological parents. Anyway, obviously think that they're acting in the common good, but actually if you look at the policies that have been pursued, they have tended to reflect the concerns of interests of anywhere people. So they've been quite relaxed about high immigration, and they live in the leafy parts of town where the immigration is lower. The forms that openness have taken in our societies, have hugely benefited anywheres, and much less so when it comes to somewheres. And they don't want to live in a closed society. They want to live with forms of openness that benefit them. The idea of investing in a baby has just become too demanding for people. Liberalism is very weak on community and belonging, the value of authority and tradition. Social policy has essentially been designed with the interests of the 20% of career-focused women in mind. But there's a very, very big proportion of the female population whose voice is not heard, who do want to have families and not to feel so stressed and not to be pushed back into the labour market.
I'm Dr. Randy Bach, and I'm honored today to have with me David Goodhart. He is an author. He's been with the Financial Times. He's an editor. He has an illustrious history. I'm going to let him maybe limb over that a little bit himself. And he's the author of multiple books. The one that intrigued me was The Road to Somewhere. And he can explain those a little bit better. I think there's a trilogy now, and it has to do with the paradox of a caring society that has kind of lost its sensibilities of how to care. And he's kind of a third rail kind of guy. He's not afraid to touch some of the electric lines that go through our society and call them for what they are. So I appreciate a clairvoyant in the sense of seeing clearly, not necessarily the future, but some aspects of the past. Maybe a little bit of the future we'll find out. So David, tell us a little bit more about yourself and what brought you to this aspect of, say, truth teller in the world, and how does that figure into your own, personal and professional dynamics?
Oh, okay. Well, thanks for the invitation, first of all, Randy. And good to be here. So brief biog. I'm actually half American. I've got two American grandfathers, but both my parents are half American, so I'm probably a bit less half American than if one of my parents had been fully American, if you get what I mean. I'm actually related on my father's side to the Lehman family, the Lehman, as in Lehman Brothers. I'm great grandson of Mayor Lehman, one of the founders. And my American grandfather, came over to the UK just before the First World War. And he was actually I think he was sent by Lehman Brothers to study economics. It was because economics had only really just been, the first economics department was opened at Cambridge University in the mid 1890s, Alfred Marshall, and but the economist he was meant to be studying under was ill or had died or was away. So they said, you can't study under this guy, but there is this other fellow at King's College, Cambridge, but we don't think he's very sound. Of course, it turned out to be Keynes. But my grandfather, being a conformist guy, said, "Oh well, I don't want to study under someone who's not sound." And by the way, I think sound. I've actually just read a huge biography of Keynes, a brilliant biography by a guy called Robert Skidelsky. And actually, in 1912, Keynes was very sound economically. He hadn't broken away from the kind of neoclassical model. So I think what they meant was that he was.
Yes.
a homosexual. Anyway, so I come from a privileged background, but thanks partly to the Lehman money. My dad was a Conservative MP. I went to a famous public school, the four-letter word one, Eton. And I kind of rebelled against all that and became a lefty in my late teens, and then kind of moved gradually to a more sort of sensible centre-left position. I was a journalist. I set up a magazine called Prospect. It was a kind of monthly magazine. I set it up in the mid-90s, partly because as you mentioned, I'd worked on the Financial Times. I was actually a correspondent in Germany during the unification period, and that kind of made me more ambitious to rather than just go back to the FT in London and spend the next 15 years maybe becoming features editor. I set up this magazine called Prospect. It was sort of modeled on the kind of Atlantic Monthly kind of essays, more a mixture of left and right voices. Anyway, it was that I wrote an essay in my own magazine in 2004 called "Too Diverse?" It was a rather sort of tentative exploration of the tension between the centre left's sort of two main impulses, principles, that of solidarity and diversity. And it said there's a tension if you based on the common sense idea that people are readier to share with and trust people with whom they have something in common. Based on that common sense assumption, we have to be careful about becoming too diverse too quickly. And the whole essay, 6,000 words of it, was reprinted in the Guardian newspaper, the main newspaper of the centre left. I mean, I very much regarded myself. I mean, Prospect was considered a sort of pro New Labour, Tony Blair kind of magazine, this created a kind of this sort of huge ructions. I think, partly because the magazine was considered sort of on the liberal side of politics. If I'd written that in the Spectator or a conservative magazine, nobody would really have noticed. Anyway, that kind of set me off on a path. I became very interested in the whole question of race and immigration and multiculturalism. I became the sort of BBC's go-to guy because I was considered a sort of decent liberal, but one who could actually say what many people in the country felt, that immigration was out of control and cultural change was happening too quickly. The economic benefits were exaggerated. The costs were underestimated, both economic and cultural. I ended up writing a book called The British Dream, which is meant to be, was an attempt at a kind of balanced account of an audit of post-war immigration. What had worked, what hadn't worked. I left the magazine that I'd set up in 2010 and moved into the think tank world, and I continued working as a journalist. And I then wrote a book after the Brexit vote. Or rather, I started writing a book to try and it was a kind of an attempt at a sympathetic understanding of populism. Why was it that in our apparently very rich, successful, free, democratic societies, very large minorities, if not majorities, of our fellow citizens felt so uncomfortable about the modern world? And I wrote this book. It came out in early 2017. I started writing it actually just before the Brexit vote in June 2016. I finished writing it just after Trump was his first election victory in November 2016. It came out early 2017. It's called The Road to Somewhere, as you mentioned. And I coined these terms: the people from anywhere and the people from somewhere, the people that see the world from anywhere, the people that see the world from somewhere. And it was about the kind of the education-based value divides, the anywheres being, the highly educated, often mobile, particularly in the UK, but also in the US. I mean, Ivy League universities tend to be residential universities, certainly the upper echelons of the higher education system here. In fact, not just the upper echelons, about 75% of all university students in the UK are in residential universities. I think in the case of a lot of state universities in the US, you often would stay in your hometown, maybe even stay living with your parents. So mobility, that the experience of mobility when you're quite young, I think often means that you're sort of you're taken out of the original context of your life, and you mix then in a sort of, as it were, in the kind of the proto elite of society. Um, so anywheres tend to be comfortable with openness and change, and somewheres, and anywhere worldview is a perfectly decent worldview. Um, the problem is it's been too dominant in our societies, and there's a very large group. The anywheres probably represent 25-30% of the population. Um, I mean, I invented the labels. I didn't invent the worldviews. I mean, they're there in. I mean, I was basing my analysis mainly on the UK. So I was looking at the British social attitude surveys, and if you look at the correlations between education levels and attitudes, and you can come to these sorts of numbers. About 25% have a kind of anywhere worldview. Somewheres are a bigger group, perhaps 40-50% of the population tend to be less well educated, and their identities are more attached to place and group. Um, if you look at who was it? Tolkien Parsons, who came up with this idea of a spectrum between achieved and ascribed identities. I mean, we're all on somewhere on this spectrum, um, but anywheres tend to have achieved identity, a sense of themselves as almost their own invention. They've done well at school, they've gone to more or less good universities, they have more or less successful professional careers. They have achieved identities, whereas somewheres tend to have their identities are more based around those things about them that are immutable. Your white male, northern working class, or whatever. Um, and the somewhere worldview exposes you, I think, to greater discomfort with change. And this is something that anywheres often, I think, find very difficult to understand. And I think it's sort of helped to explain in some ways the kind of the failure of the centre left, which tends to be kind of anywhere leaning. Um, and yeah, I mean, by the way, there are lots of different kinds. I mean, it sounds very simplistic and binary, and that was one of the critiques of the book. But actually, if you read it, there are lots of different kinds of anywheres, lots of different kinds of somewheres, and there's a big in-betweener group, people who kind of share aspects of both the anywhere and the somewhere worldview. Anyway, the book was unfortunately never actually published in the US, although it's kind of made its way across the Atlantic. It's mentioned occasionally. David Brooks mentioned it in the Anywhere Somewhere sort of pairing has been picked up a bit. I then I've just I've written another couple of books which are sort of pursuing the same theme about sort of the critique of anywhere over dominance of our politics and economy. The second one was called Head, Hand, Heart: The Struggle for Status and Dignity in the 21st Century, which was a sort of critique of a over narrow version of meritocracy. I mean, a form of placing. I mean, obviously, we're all meritocrats in the sense that no one wants to be operated on by someone who's failed their surgery exams. We want competent people to be in the right positions. We want an open elite, obviously, so far as possible, and yeah. And the problem is we have too narrow. I mean, kind of Michael Sandel is also a critic of meritocracy. I think his emphasis is more on the sort of the self-regard of the meritocratic elite. I mean, my emphasis is more on the narrowness of how we measure merit. I mean, it's been over academicized. It places far too much status, I think, on analytical sort of data processing type intelligences, and much less on kind of emotional intelligence, on practical know-how. And these things are still extremely valuable in our society. And obviously we need lots of clever people still, but too many people have been sort of have kind of benefited from the slipstream of the very clever, as it were, and 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 attract almost a kind of unfair amount of status compared to many people who are doing equally, if not more, valuable things in kind of less cognitive spheres of life. And then my most recent book, which I rather grandly call the sort of the third in my kind of anywhere critique trilogy is called The Care Dilemma: Caring Enough in the Age of Sex Equality. And I think one of the anywhere people tend to be very public realm oriented people, and I think the neglect of the domestic sphere and the family lies behind many of our biggest social problems, and it's one that politicians are very loath to talk about, um, partly for the good reason that politicians' own family lives are often somewhat chaotic, and and people are rightly fearful of being hypocritical, of sort of saying one thing and doing another thing. Um, but for all sorts of reasons, I think the family has. It's one of the biggest gaps, I would say, and I think this applies to the US as much as the UK. One of the biggest gaps between the views of the political class and the views of ordinary voters. So I think that the undervaluing of the domestic realm, I think, lies behind. Well, it is an expression of the unstable family. The unstable family is responsible, I think, for aspects of the mental health or mental fragility crisis amongst younger people. Now, there are all sorts of other things too. I think Jonathan Haidt and his point about social media and iPhones, I think, is smartphones, I think, is well made. But I think there's another elephant in the room, or rather, there's an elephant in the room, in that the Haidt thesis is very well widely discussed and accepted. But I think behind it there is, why is it that these kids are spending so much time on their phones? Is because there is so little family life structure, that people sitting down having meals together and having conversations. That is happening much less. Their parents are on their phones the whole time. So I think it's a kind of broad. I mean, there's a bigger tension here between freedom, particularly for women, and the continuing demands of care in our society. Um, and a lot has changed in the last 60 years, and a lot of it, the reason it's a dilemma is that many of the changes have been very beneficial, particularly for women. But we've not done a proper kind of audit on it. So, compared with 60 years ago, we're a lot richer, we're better educated, we have much greater control over our life course, particularly if we're a woman. On the other hand, we are also much more likely to live alone, much more likely to suffer from depression, we're less likely to have children. And if we are a child, we're much less likely to live with both of our biological parents. I mean, in the UK, it's nearly half of children are not living with both of their biological parents by the age of 14. I suspect it's something similar in the US. And I look at how the undervaluing of the family in the domestic realm has led not only or has contributed to the the various problems, the mental fragility crisis, and so on, but also obviously contributing very directly to the very sharp fall in fertility, and the undervaluing of care more generally has led to a real crisis of recruitment in those face-to-face care jobs,
Mm.
that remain so undervalued.
There's a lot there. I appreciate your work and your effort, and you certainly have gone at this in depth and comprehensively. And I'm in your debt for that. I've been reading the Care Dilemma book, uh, uh, which you were kind enough to forward, and it's really, brings up a lot of interesting points. While you were speaking, I got to say, I mean, it could be my mental illness, but I was thinking about my recently late dog. We had Marshall with us for a dozen years, and he passed his mortal coil and our household and so forth. Now, if I could, theoretically, in this kind of atomized uh, anywhere world, I could, I could call up a dog and rent a dog. I could Uber a dog. I mean, there could be an agency, and there are some. I actually saw kind of the um, happy but hugely sad episode. I was in the MIT area for a number of years working on that startup, and they would bring in pets for the day, and the MIT students could cuddle with something, and so they had little bunny rabbits and cats and puppies and whatnot, and it turned out I walked in because it was there, and it was like 90% women, and they're grad students and whatnot. So they're in their 20s and what, and they're cuddling with these bunny rabbits and cats and dogs, and that's it for the day. So they had it, and it was kind of it reminded me a little bit. It was before COVID, but it reminded me a little bit later on what people had with COVID. They had these kind of forlorn and wistful moments, kind of touching the plastic screen of their elderly, the care dilemma of that time. But for me, it also pointed out that there's a lot more women at MIT than there used to be. Back I applied and I got into MIT 1,000 years ago, um, but back then it was 5% of the class were women. Now everything has to be 50-50, and at MIT, which is a tech school, and anyway, the women there, they were holding the bunnies, but when they kind of leave and whatnot, they go back to their grad school lives. It's kind of back to the grind and so forth. And I think the fact that this care day with the bunny rabbits and whatnot was mostly women points to kind of the care dichotomy that is probably much more ingrained in the women's DNA in their brain formation and whatnot than in the guys. But also this unitary moment where they could have that caring go on, and then they're back to doing, I don't know, particle physics or something like that. But in my instance, we have a dog, and it wasn't just any dog; it was our dog. We identify with the dog. The dog knows us, and there's kind of a caring. You see him as a person. You tell him your secrets and whatnot. I know there's kind of an allusion to that, but that is in the essence of what is a someplace, versus any place. That's your dog. You can't just get the Uber of dogs. You can't just like, oh, I need somebody to walk around the block with today. You call Uber, they drop a dog off, and you walk around and then you let the dog off. This is not something, but this is what happens with kind of our Tinder society. People are like scrolling, they're getting the right pet. I mean, pet has kind of the sexual connotation here as well. They were petting and what, maybe back in the day. I don't know if people still even bother with petting. They go right to the action, and then they're on to the next thing. And so they're kind of like they don't get their own personal pet who whatever. I've got my little manacle here, my gold manacle. We've been tethered together, and we are each other's pet, I guess. And we're not necessarily interchangeable, but this kind of concept that everything kind of becomes interchangeable. We're moving to this, again, atomized sensibility, and then now there's polyamory and this and that, and people are, trying all different kind of Lego combinations where they're trying to fit the pieces into each other in ways that don't necessarily form cohesive structures. So there's, it's just kind of I think we all see and get this. Where's the next question? I'm curious. Well, as you were speaking, I was also thinking of Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart, which I don't think uses this exact same formulation, but I'll just, for our initiates in the audience, he looks at two towns, and they are called Belmont, named after Belmont, Massachusetts, of which I'm next door. Currently, it's a neat leafy suburb just like my own, and the elites live there, and they live very kind of traditional lives themselves. They're married. They make their kids take piano lessons. They don't do this, don't do drugs, stay in school, all that kind of stuff. And Fishtown was named after a place outside Philadelphia, which is more rough and tumble, blue collar, and whatnot. And the sense there is that all the ideas that get machinated out of the Belmont elites get applied in Fishtown. So, the free needles, needle exchanges. Oh, that's a great idea. It's going to make, drug lives easier, harm reduction, whatnot. Well, the needle exchanges wind up ruining a place like Fishtown. I worked in essentially Fishtown. It's called Revere here. It's a blue collar near suburb of Boston, and a lot of the bad ideas that get worked out in the elites. We have Harvard, which is our Belmont, I guess, and these ideas get worked out by in your formulation, the anywheres, and they get applied to the somewheres. And just to kind of bring in one of my favorite quotes, H.L. Mencken, who was kind of the successor of Mark Twain in a sense, methodologically, or humoristically, he said democracy is the policy by which the people vote for what they want, and they deserve to get it, good and hard. And so there's this kind of aspect where there's you know two choices. Basically, you can do what the elites want, or you can vote against what the elites want. You'll get it anyway. And that seemed to be very much put out and through the Brexit vote, and then the really the inability for the elites to encapsulate that and whatnot. We see this with Donald Trump as well. It just seems to be like an immune reaction or a vomiting up of what the people actually want, and they're too stupid and too ignorant to know what they want. And what they want is something like what you're talking about with the someplace aspect. They want cohesion, they want family, they want comfort, they want things, frankly, that the Belmont people get all the time. I'll just give one example. We have Martha's Vineyard out here. It's again all very local stuff from Massachusetts for some reason, but that's where Obama has his oceanfront climate change denying mansion, right? 2 inches above sea level, which is presumably not going to change in his case. And I believe some of the illegals, some of the clever governors from the South in Texas and Florida, shipped up some illegal immigrants to put into Martha's Vineyard, a few hundred, whatever, and they were quickly whisked away, because the idea is that Martha's Vineyard only makes sense if it has exactly the things you're talking about. It has mutual trust. It's literally an island, and literally it's not an entry fee to get in. You can take the ferry there. But as far as living there, it's a huge barrier to entry, a couple $1,000,000. And that, means that you can walk around, you can leave your cell phone, lying on the street, and somebody's going to find and pick it up and give it back to you. No rape, no murder, none of this stuff that everyone's very, very happy societally to inject elsewhere. So this is kind of the coming apart paradigm, and the anywheres are doing the H.L. Mencken dance on the somewheres. In the UK, I was reading I don't know how valid the poll was, but it's like it was asked, is multiculturalism, which is another great term. Nobody, I was saying earlier that, the left has much better terminology for whatever reason, probably because they get the media and they get to try these things out. The ones that stick. They have diversity, equity, inclusion. They've got affirmative action, and now they have multiculturalism, which sounds great. But it turns out that the multi, might very well be Sharia. And it's a lot of applications of things that don't work out for the in the sense of kind of like violent exclusive actions and whatnot, don't work out. And I think the poll was 95-5 against whether multiculturalism has worked in the UK. So where's the question for you? Well, the question is, how's that working out for you? I mean, I'm curious, just kind of on the political scene in the UK,
Yeah.
amongst the class you might find yourself in. How do you see yourself? Do people see you as kind of a Cassandra, to be heard about but ignored ultimately? How do things play out on the political scene? You're kind of stuck with this farmer government for a while.
Yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, I was seen, as someone who'd sort of turned my back on the progressive path. But curiously enough, I mean, because our populist party is now doing very well, so the Labour Party, the governing party here, are scurrying to cover their tracks, as it were. So that last week there was an immigration white paper that made all the arguments that mass migration skeptics like me have been making for 20 years. And I mean, I think they're in a very, very difficult position, because we've had this huge surge. We've had a huge increase in immigration in the last few years, and they've tried to play the role of the kind of immigration restrictionists, and tried to paint the Conservatives, who've historically been more on the restrictionist side, as the kind of laissez-faire liberals who have been playing this kind of open door experiment. But it's not going to be enough, I don't think. I mean, I think the populists will continue to. I mean, partly because it's just the pace of demographic change. I mean, the white British population of England is probably now down to about 70%. Um, it's a bit more than that for the UK as a whole, because Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland have had rather lower immigration over the recent years, and that and that's gone from a figure of maybe sort of 8 or 9% at the turn of the century. So it's an enormously rapid change, um, and and many people feel uncomfortable about it. I mean, it's not. I mean, the multiculturalism story, the multi-ethnic story, is a very mixed one. It's been quite successful in some ways. We had a, a, a prime minister of South Asian background, East African Asian background. Rishi Sunak was our last prime minister, and nobody really batted an eyelid. I mean, people were more worried about the size of his bank balance than his ethnicity, which is a good thing. And we've a whole generation of very successful, often actually conservative politicians from ethnic minority backgrounds, and some ethnic minorities have done very well and integrated pretty well. Others much less so. I mean, particularly Muslims. There are, there are very, big problems with parallel lives in many of our former industrial towns. And of course, it tends to be working class parts of the country that have had the biggest inflow of people, and these are the places that are under the greatest strain, because policy has been so much. I mean, it's the great anywhere hypocrisy. I mean, anywheres obviously think that they're liberal-minded people, that they're acting in the common good, but actually, if you look at the policies that have been pursued by kind of anywhere-leaning governments, they have tended to reflect the concerns of interests of anywhere people. So they've been quite relaxed about high immigration, and they live in the leafy parts of town where the immigration is lower. They've been kind of somewhat post-national in their attachments. So national sovereignty means less to them than it does to the average Joe, often partly because they need the state less. They need the nation state less than the average Joe does for their both for kind of economic and status reasons. So our elites, our anywhere elites, have been very happy um, to trade national sovereignty for various kinds of benefits, economic or otherwise. There's been a huge influence on the knowledge economy, completely relaxed about deindustrialization. Um, when it comes to education, Tony Blair made a famous speech at the end of the last century, saying 50%, half of all school leavers should go to university, while the old vocational training systems have been allowed to rot. And you've also had the sort of metropolitanization of society. I mean, I don't know. I suspect this is true in the US too. It's certainly true in a lot of European countries. Indeed, the concept of sort of métropolisation comes from, there's a French guy called Pierre, a historian actually called Pierre Vermeeren, who I've just come across his work, and he's looked at the 12 biggest metropolitan centres in France, account for only about 25% of the population, but they account for something like 60+% of GDP. They have three-quarters of all the richer, high-income people, and of course, all of the political class and the media class. And so, this sense of being a second-class citizen that many somewheres feel has a sort of geographical aspect to it, and uh, uh, there have been there have been benefits. But there are too many losers now from this whole system, that the populists, they call the traditional parties of centre right and centre left the uni party, because they've essentially tended to do more or less the same things. I mean, with very, very minor differences between them. But there is now, a very an increasingly powerful voice that wants to really significantly reduce immigration. Wants to, I mean, the possibilities of significant reindustrialization, I think, are pretty limited. But I mean, some, we saw in the pandemic the kind of anxiety about supply chains. We're all going to have to boost our defense industries, which tend to be more nationally based. So I think there's an element of kind of reindustrialization that will happen anywhere. I mean, I think we've hugely overexpanded higher education in the UK and across much of the developed world. Um, and I think there will be a kind of recognition that actually we do, that actually the kind of the working as a plumber or an electrician or whatever is not only a perfectly respectable job, but it's also an extremely well paid one. And that I think there is there is a switch back. I think as more and more kids get loaded with huge student debt, which is a relatively recent thing here. The last sort of 20 years or so. I think we will see a shrinkage of higher education, or perhaps many of these colleges will sort of switch to being more vocational colleges than academic institutes of higher education. So I think, I mean, I just wrote an essay the other day in which I was sort of talking about the power balance, as it were, between anywheres and somewheres, and I think we're in a kind of impasse that the populist parties in Europe are strong enough, and I mean, I use kind of populist and somewhere interchangeably, not necessarily completely the case. There are many somewheres who wouldn't necessarily vote for populist parties, but probably most of them would. Um, and there's sort of we've reached a kind of impasse in that somewhere. I mean, populist parties have been in governments in Europe now for 20 years more, and indeed in some cases have dominated them. Italy, Poland, etc. Hungary, Slovakia, exactly. They're kind of strong enough. If you look at the continent as a whole, they're kind of strong enough to prevent further liberalisation along anywhere lines. Um, um, uh, and I would say, the kind of the openness that suits the both the kind of mentality, but also off pocketbook of anywhere people. It is now kind of that there is now a constraint on it. And by the way, I would say um, I've never met anybody who wants to live in a closed society, but the forms that openness have taken in our societies, have hugely benefited anywheres, and much less so when it comes to somewheres. And they want, they don't want to live in a closed society. They want to live with forms of openness that benefit them. um, and yeah, but I think we've got to this impasse where anywhere the pursuit of more liberalization, more openness, there is now a constraint on it, but the kind of somewhere populist parties are not yet strong enough to impose their will. I mean, the US may be. I mean, the Trump voters are mainly somewhere voters. It may be that the US will be the kind of the model of how. I mean, obviously, Trump is a kind of strange and erratic figure, and the whole thing may blow up. But the program does seem to be one in which they're seeking. Perhaps. One of the things I often say is that we shouldn't just move from a kind of, as it were, a dictatorship of the anywheres to a dictatorship of the somewheres. We need a new balance. Now, Trump is a very revengeful sort of figure. He wants a dictator of the Trumps, supported by willing somewhere voters. But I think in an ideal world, we get a rebalancing. I mean, both the anywhere and the somewhere worldview are perfectly decent, at least in their mainstream form. The problem, to repeat, is that one has been over dominant, and it's kind of unbalanced the boat of modern
Well,
politics.
I would push back on that a little bit.
Mm,
You know, the my sons, adults, went to Malta and Tunisia, maybe 5 years ago, whatever. And Malta and Tunisia are near each other, and they're very, very different societies. Malta is kind of a Disney set. It's like a Hollywood set. There's houses and whatnot, but there's no people there. People have places there, and they live there. It's a beautiful spot, but it's not a thriving or surviving or alive society. And Tunisia's haphazard and messier and whatnot, but there are people roaming around on the streets, and you run into each other, and there's markets and souks and whatnot. And it was a very different experience. Now, where would I rather live? I'd probably rather live in Malta. It's quieter, cleaner, um, and I have a little worry about Islamic societies in general, although Tunisia is not an Islamic state per se. Um, but the UK and a lot of places in Europe wind up having this what I call Disney effect, where they become Disneyland. They become a museum society, and they look like a place, but it's kind of they're kind of a Potemkin village representation of what they used to be. They're a mapping of what a society was. The society that got the buildings that got there, the tube, and all the trappings of society came from an earlier stage when people had better sensibilities of what their responsibilities and their limits were. Um, I was listening to Konstantin Kisin, and he was in a debate about net zero or something like that, which doesn't seem relevant. But he was saying, yeah, UK is net zero or verging towards it, but at what expense? Nothing you have is made here. All you've done is outsource your pollution. And so if you want to, I don't know, have whatever it happens to be, an automobile or whatever, and it's made elsewhere and put together at the pollution cost of someplace else, and then you say, oh, you're all clean because you bought it somewhere else. That's missing kind of the machine part that underlies society. And as far as being Disney, you can go at Disneyland or something like that, or Disney World, and you can go on one of the rides, and you can have an experience of a I don't know, seeing the characters and the people, whatever, being in Star Wars or whatever. I haven't been in Disney World for a long time. Whatever happens to be the ride, but you're missing all the stuff that happens on the outside. All the people who are milling around, working, manning that, keeping the place clean. Security. HR, all this stuff. There's a whole apparatus that's happening outside your experience, and I think a lot of the societies have wind up kind of Disneyfying themselves into this illusion that they are a functioning society, but in point of fact, they're on a ride, and they've missed out on kind of the organic aspect of the say earlier iterations of their own society that built it, wherein the builders and the workers were somebody with you that you might have known from grammar school or whatever, and then those are the people that you care about. In my kind of Charles Murray formulation, I live in his two aspects of his coming apart. I work and I own property in the Fishtown aspect in Revere, which is blue collar. I was just at an event there for the mayor like a few days ago, and the sensibility there is much more of cohesion. It's more kind of the somewhere town where the plumbers. They're not just people. They're talking about the builders and whatnot, and they have kind of a more not seamless. I don't know if the word seamful makes sense, but they have a seeming seamful where they have a cohesion. They understand who those people are. Now they're having some in migration and whatnot, but I'm not saying it's paradise on earth. It's more of again blue. We use the term blue collar kind of place, working class place. But the people they don't necessarily move out. They might get wealthy and do well there, but they stay there, and not exclusively. But a lot of what happens is that I think there's a bit better cohesion of the place, and in the George Floyd era, there was no graffiti, there's no rioting and whatnot. Is it the best place on earth? No. I live in the Belmont part, which is a leafy suburb, and everything looks beautiful here. But there's a lot of tensions because the I don't think the drama of life has hit here. But a lot of people espouse the theories that will, in some way and level, wind up being their downfall and their undoing. And so we are, having. I don't want to get too far into that, but there's some schisms here that were exhibited during COVID era, where people could see the school curriculum, which was kind of this Maoist struggle session happening in our schools, where that people are being segregated by their race, they're being applied their ancestral guilt of having been the oppressor and the colonial, whatever. And I think that this, the elements there of societal decay and breakup, that's not a question per se. I don't know if you could touch on that, and I also would like to spend the last third of the time talking a little bit about um, uh, kind of the uh, I guess the feminine liberation and whatnot, and feminism, I guess, is the word, and how that applies, and whether a lot of these things again wind up making this Malta-esque Disneyification of a society that doesn't reproduce, that's not in touch with its own kids, that even if she has a child, winds up fobbing them off at 9 months to a care center and so forth. And have we lost kind of the touch, the smell, the cohesion, the essence? I mean, literally, that is the word of smell. The essence of society, where people know each other based on smell. Again, getting back to my late canine friend. If there were 1,000 people in a stadium, he would find me. You
Mm.
know, he would find me based on his living with me and whatever weird smells I give off. Fortunately, we're on a Zoom call, but you can't find them. But that is kind of like the humanity of something. The hug that person. You could hug the wall. You could hug a pillow. You could hug a teddy bear to go to sleep. But that's not the same as that person that you see that brings tears to your eyes. And
Mm.
the
Mm.
COVID experience was exactly that. We call them the laptop class, but I like your terminology better.
Mm.
The anywheres did it to the somewheres. And is there still a society if it becomes kind of this atomized, artificialized, Disneyfied? Have your kid and pop them off to a machine place that'll kind of buff them down and smooth them back and give them back to you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's kind of the loss of particularism, the loss of the understanding that to draw on purpose and connection, you need to invest in people and places. And I like your concept of the kind of the Uberization of life. You can't just you can't just borrow the dog for one walk. I mean, there'd be no point. The whole point of the relationship with the dog is it's built up over time, um, and of course the I mean, I think often it's rather sad to see the way that dogs are used as kind of maternal or parental substitutes, as our birth rates collapse. It's just the idea of investing in a baby has just become too demanding for people. I mean, I do think, I mean, it's part of a sort of the broader failures of sort of anywhere liberalism are just coming home to roost. I mean, um, the liberalism is very weak on community and belonging. It's very weak on the value of authority and tradition. It's very weak on providing meaning and purpose in a post-religious age, perhaps particularly for people who are of average or below average intelligence. I mean, the Anywhere worldview, as I was touching on, is very focused on the academically able. Um, it's a world designed for clever people, but most of by definition, most of us are of average ability. Um,
I hate to
and
hear that, right?
and there used to be it used to be easier to live an achieved life, a life that was recognized. You may not be very rich, but you had a kind of role and a purpose. Now, obviously, there's also a lot to be said for people being able to kind of move both socially and geographically. Um, but I think, I mean, the weak, the decline of family, I think, does is one of the great emblems of this failure. Our inability to connect. I mean, the so-called crisis of intimacy, which is making it harder for people to come together in the first place. The the inability of couples to stay together, to invest together in the lives of their children. Um, uh, and I think the undervaluing of motherhood, the continuing undervaluing of motherhood. Now, nobody wants to go back to the 1950s. I mean, you know, back to my concept of the care dilemma. I mean, the dilemma is How can we and how particularly can women enjoy the greater freedoms that have been achieved in recent decades without losing what was good in the family, in motherhood. I mean, the undervaluing of motherhood continues. All our economic policy is just about pushing women back into the labour market as soon as they've had a baby, and it's not popular. So 9%, only 9% of British people. It's probably less than that now. A few years ago, British social attitude surveys, people were asked to agree or disagree with the statement. A man should go out to work and a woman should look after the household and children. 10 years or so ago, only 9% of people supported that. It's probably 5% now. I mean, this is very few people support that. Equally, only 9% of people, when asked what are the ideal arrangements for looking after preschool children, only 9% of people said both parents working full time. That it's very, very unpopular, and a lot of the actual number in the UK is more like it's 35%, I think, of parents with preschool children. Both of them are working full time. Um, and in many cases, particularly on the part of the woman, it's very, very reluctantly so. In order to maintain the kind of lifestyle that people want, they have to do that. And we should be we should be making it possible for one parent, possibly increasingly the man, as women often now out earn their partner. Um, but probably in most cases it'll continue to be the woman. Make it easier for people to stay at home in those crucial early years. That's when there's so much stress on your relationship too, when both of you are working full time and trying to manage a young family. Maybe also trying to climb up the greasy pole at work. No wonder so many relationships fail. We need to reinvest in that whole area of life, and you know why not pay people to have babies? I mean, a productive, a well brought up productive member of society is of great benefit to our society and to the treasury. In the long run, we should set, the incentives are all wrong at the moment. And I mean, I is feminism responsible for this? Not. I mean, I think it's because there's a sociologist in the UK called Catherine Hackim who talks about adult British women being divided into three groups: 20% who are very work focused, may want to have families too, but are very, what the family will sort of fit in around professional career. 20% who are very family focused, traditional women, if you like, and 60% who kind of want to balance both of these things. But when children are young, are happy to be at home or to work part time. Um, and social policy in the UK, and most of the developed world, probably in the US too, has essentially been designed with the interests of the 20% of career-focused women in mind. And now, obviously, they have legitimate interests, and we should make it as easy as possible for women to combine careers and family. Um, but there's a very, very big proportion of the female population whose voice is not heard in the public policy debate. Who do want to have families and not to feel so stressed and not to be pushed back into the labour market. And I think, I mean, people talk about the feminization of society, and clearly, in the last, I mean, it's interesting to compare, how we reacted to the Spanish flu 100 years ago. The Spanish flu, which was far more virulent than COVID, killed babies as well as old people. We did absolutely nothing about it. Um, 100 years later, we closed down our societies and economies for a virus that was far less fatal. Um, and it's interesting to sort of to try and is that because in that 100 years, 100 years ago, women barely had the vote, um, and now 40% of MPs are women. Nearly half. I mean, they dominate in higher education. Various institutions of society are now very much dominated by women. Higher education, publishing, much of the health sector, much of the public sector in the UK, anyway. Um, and that comparing the Spanish flu and COVID, I think, is really interesting because can you disentangle how much of that is to do with the much greater role of women in society, the much louder voice of women in society, and how much of it is just because we're a lot richer? When you're a lot richer, you can afford, as it were, to protect people from harm more. So I think, I mean, but anyway, I mean, my argument in the care dilemma is that. We've both had sort of too much feminization in some areas and too little in others. I mean, the failure to, you could say in some ways that the failure to value motherhood, the kind of the undervaluing of domesticity and motherhood, is a kind of is a failure of is not enough feminization in a way. Um, but in so many other areas, I mean, there is some evidence in universities. Is it? I can't remember the name of the academic. There's a woman who's done these surveys, and women academics are far less interested in academic freedom, put sort of social justice causes, above, above independent inquiry and so on. There are definite areas. You might even say, the kind of over regulation. The HR department is majority female. Are we? The protection from harm. If we accept, one of the reasons I think we can now talk, in a relatively neutral way about feminization, is because most mainstream feminism, I think, has now accepted the idea that men and women are not are equal, but they're not the same. I mean, the whole trans debate has helped in this respect. That there are significant differences. That the men are more aggressive, they're more risk taking, they're less empathetic than women. So, given these fundamental factors that most sensible people now agree on. I mean, it used to be an article of faith of feminism, that you had to agree that men and women are not only equal, but exactly the same. I think we've sort of grown out of that now, so we can have this conversation. And it may be that, that the risk of, the greater risk averseness of the majority of it. Obviously, we're talking about averages and majorities here, not there are outliers obviously all over the place. That the risk aversion has gone too far in some respects in the way that we manage our economies, or our social services or whatever. But then in other respects, as I say, we're not. In the UK, we've been arguing about how to deal with social care. So our health system is separate from care for the elderly, and because we just spent a couple of budgets back. It was still a conservative government. They decided to spend an extra £5 billion, £4 billion a year on childcare, on top of the already existing 4 or 5 billion they were spending. So I think we now spend something like £8 to £9 billion a year, whereas social care continues to be ignored. There's another commission. It's going to be, the can is kicked down the road. And I think that's so much because childcare seems to represent women's future, um, competing equally with men in the professions and the job market. Whereas social care, which is overwhelmingly like 80% female occupation, seems to represent women's past. In the domestic sphere, looking after old people, even if you're doing it in the labour market, in a care home, in the private sector. So I think I think you are seeing. I, I mean, I think we will. I think there will be a shift back. I think we will come to see, particularly, the economics will save us. I think it'll become more and more clear to people that the dependency ratio, fewer and fewer workers are supporting more and more elderly people living longer lives and so on. I think people will just see the dramatic. I mean, we're going to have to abandon the welfare state in a couple of decades unless we
Yeah.
can improve our.
I'm not sure about the prognosis. I think you got the process right. I think this, a lot there. We're probably going to have another session to go over more of this.
Mm,
You're a font of knowledge, and I really am in debt for your having been there here with us today. I would probably leave with the last thought about feminine versus feminist. I don't think those are the same things. I think women can have both or either or one or the other, but um, they're not the same thing. The feminist is often against the feminine. And I think the overriding and overweening and overarching and over controlling concern of feminism is to duplicate the male life and be better at it than men.
mm,
And as you point out, the trans episode in our societies have pointed out a lot of the strange fault lines of these kind of thinking, because maybe it goes the other way around, that men are better at being women than women are. They're certainly better long jumpers and basketball players if they join those girls teams. And so
mm.
I think women are getting a sense of proper lines and whatnot, and what.
I call it I call it male default feminism. I mean, the idea that feminism is only about making it easier for women to compete more equally with men, across the spectrum.
Right. Yeah, yeah. It's a funny thing. And, the feminist world has wanted men to be, have the equal number of accountants, and say maybe the equal number of lawyers and equal number of governors, or MPs or whatever, but they're not really that intent on having an equal number of plumbers and an equal number of uh, uh,
prisoners.
yeah, or minors or whatever. Some of those things. Fine. You can do that. You can be the undersea diver, and
Mm,
the ones, window cleaners for the skyscrapers and whatnot. We're going to leave those dangerous professions to you, and we're going to have a society that's kind of postmodern and whatnot, where we're willing to share piece of the boardroom, but not the boiler room.
mm,
So there's a lot there.
mm,
I'd love to have you back on and maybe cover a lot of things we didn't get to today. But
sure.
I'm going to have to thank you for your time today, and have people go hunt you down or find you on X. And here is your book.
I've just started a Substack as well. It's called "A Good Heart is Hard to Find."
Is it spelled with your name there?
My name, yeah, yeah, yeah,
Well,
without
that's
the
excellent.
yeah.
I've got my own coming out. Which I sent you an article for,
Oh yeah,
and
yeah, yeah. I had a look at that. Yeah, the autism stuff, very
yeah,
interesting.
well, it's not my thing per se, but I like to dive into something and find out
Yeah,
where it goes. To wit, people want to help support my podcast and efforts. They can go buy my book. It's called Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. People might have forgotten about it. It has nothing to do really with what we're talking here, except in the broader sense that the anywheres have applied false formulation on the somewheres. And hilarity ensued, actually more tragedy than anything else. So there are some themes that would coincide, because nobody has retracted this bad theory, even though the theory has disappeared. So women are still working under a false premise that a single mosquito bite can damage cherished life within
mm,
irrevocably. And this is something that the elites have made money on by virtue of funding and whatnot, and research, and et cetera, et cetera. And the people have suffered, and their birth rates have gone down in northeast Brazil. But it's all frankly a fata morgana, and a mirage and whatnot of a false application of bad theorizing. So this is where the science has failed, as with COVID. So I wrote this in large part before COVID came around. So I was kind of a pandemicologist, by proxy, before all of that. Anyway, I recommend people buy it, and it's very because that would be great. Even better if they read it.
mm.
um, and it might be too much to ask for them to learn from it, but we'll see how things go. David, thank you so much for being on our show. I
All
look
right,
forward to talking with you again if we can, and people can go hunt down your book and your Substack and your X, and learn from you.
all right. Well, I hope so. Bye bye.
Bye bye.